So, hi everyone. I'm here with Dr. Ali Goode today. He's a cognitive scientist, and you've got a background, Ali, just in terms of working with universities from a research point of view. I know you've done stuff with ITV, just looking around attention, really. I suppose attention and engagement. And I
Mhm.
know you do a lot of work with either with universities, but also with firms in the marketing and advertising space as well, which is where we first originally met, I think.
Yeah. I call myself, depending on the company, either a lapsed or a reformed academic, because I started my career as an academic, but I've either reformed into somebody who can actually do stuff in the real world, or lapsed because I'm not doing all the academic papery things that I probably should be doing. But yeah, somewhere in between.
So thanks very much for joining me. And I suppose we originally started talking, you caught my attention, I suppose, with the talk I heard you talk about around attention and grabbing customers' attention and when to grab attention versus not. The study you were talking about was when you're watching TV on adverts and
Mm.
people were looking at their phones, which tends to be what I do, but actually that was still some of that stuff was still going in
Yeah.
terms of like grabbing attention. What does attention mean? And we've got this term in the background, attention economics, which was sort of my flag, and we had a conversation around
Mm.
that and how applicable that is. I mean, what does that attention landscape look like from some of the work that you've done?
Starting at the beginning, the attention economy and attention themselves has been very much driven by companies who work with eye tracking, webcam-based eye trackers. The slight problem with this, and sorry, that's been the main focus. So when people talk about attention, they say, oh, if they're looking at it, then that's attention. The slight problem with this is that that's not what the academic work says. Attention is an entirely different thing. And I think there's been a lot of conflation of terminology within the world of attention. So attention is a thing. It is something, but actually, when people talk about attention, they usually talk about Henry James or William James, the originator of modern psychology, who says, literally, the quote is, everybody knows what attention is. And it was updated fairly recently by a professor called Bernd Hommel, who updated it to, actually, nobody knows what attention is. It's like one of these esoteric things. It's like consciousness. We can't really define what it is. It's very hard. But we know there's something. More or less, it's kind of the ability for us, for our focus, to be pulled to and from things and what we choose to put our focus on. But that's kind of perceptually. So what things, like bright lights, large and loud noises, those kind of things attract our focus. But behind that, there's also this ability to have a kind of like if you're reading and you're hearing that internal voice in your mind, that internal kind of narrative, that thing you're saying, that again is part of attention. That can be a part of your attention system. So we have this thing called an attentional load, which is spread across all of our senses. So that means that this is the problem with the eye tracking and the measuring attention purely through eye metrics, is that if you're looking at something, if you're processing something that you're looking at, then of course your eyes are going to be on it. However, just because your eyes are on it doesn't mean you're processing it. What it means, it could be that if you're thinking about a problem at work, you're thinking about a problem at work, or you're listening to something very intently, like listening to what the kids are doing next door or what somebody's saying to you, you'll actually see less because you're taking up your attentional load with either your internal narrative or what you're listening to. So this is the main problem, I think, with the attention economy as is at the moment, is it's not based around auditory metrics. So when we talk about attention, a lot of attention at the moment has been talked about looking. Looking isn't attention. It can be attention, but it isn't necessarily attention. Hearing, attention, which is the capacity to focus on something, either with any sense. I mean, this could even be, when you're driving, if you're trying to put yourself into a tricky parking space, you have to turn the radio down and make sure your sort of eyes, ears, and your motor coordination are all working in the right place. So you get the car in the parking space. So you're using, you're recognizing you have an attentional load. So you have to have that kind of capacity to think about that. But also then there's processing. And I think one of the problems with the attention economy is it's conflated the idea of looking and seeing and perceptual stuff with internal processing cognitive stuff, which actually is what you're really interested in, because in the world of advertising, marketing, you want somebody to process what you put out there. They can put their eyes on it, but you want them to actually understand it and take that on board and mentally conceive what you said.
So in the world I work in, which is in credit risk management, operational space, and we talk about this term around engagement, and because chatting was kind of interesting in terms of you've got, well, how do you get people to engage once you've got the message across? And there's tools really around that. And then you've got this, like, how do you get them to pay attention? You're almost like exploding that, which is like, how do you get them to at least look? And then how then do you almost like then have that focus? So then the message goes in that then allows the engagement. So sort of like on that sort of stream, you're almost breaking it out into almost like different elements to a certain extent, of which there are probably tools and techniques that we can sort of think about how you do that.
I think the attention debate in advertising has very much followed the pattern of the engagement debate, which was around about 25 years ago, about what engagement is. And everybody catastrophically failed to define engagement. And I think people are learning now that attention is a very difficult thing to quantify, to understand. And I mean, particularly with the webcam eye trackers, that you can't necessarily, I mean, if you can see reading, you can probably say if somebody's reading with a dedicated eye tracker like a Tobii or an iLink, you can say, yeah, that person is definitely processing those words as they go in. But with the webcam eye tracker, they don't have that accuracy to do that. But I think engagement, I mean, it depends how you're defining engagement. Because engagement could be, again, mental engagement, where you're looking at something and you're thinking about it and you're considering the message or considering the idea that's been put across to you and how you respond to it. But engagement could also be an action, as in terms of, I mean, certainly in your risk management, if you're trying to get people to respond before they get into a worse situation than they were in the first place. Engagement could be motivating them to getting them to actually act on something. So you're trying to prompt behavior. So it could just be, so engagement could be mental, but it could also be behavioral. So I assume you're talking more about behavioral.
Yeah, the behavioral piece, which is like, well, I mean, again, you're breaking it out, which is how do you get people to then have a dialogue or actually pay attention, I suppose, to an extent, and actually then, be interactive with what you're talking about to explore the issues, and then how do you then actually get them to take action, which actually might actually be after that interaction.
Yeah. So the chain sort of is that you start off by asking the question of how you get focus on the message that you're putting to somebody to say, we need to talk. After that, you've got to work out how to construct a message that is motivating to those people to be understood and isn't kind of, in your sector, you're dealing with people who in effect are kind of in a situation they're somewhere where they don't want to be, and ignoring it is a far easier thing to do than actually engaging or actually acting on it. So it's a way of kind of not prompting that fear response, I would guess, in some, or messaging that's not that fear response, and then creating messaging that is motivating to people to actually engage and act on something. Once people have engaged and acted, motivating them to do that behavioral engagement, actually pick up the phone, write an email, do something to get them engaged or involved in some way. So I think that's the kind of list to sort of get perceptual bits in the right place, pointed at the right things, get the mind in a state where it can convey and understand the message that's being put across, and then work out strategically how that message can then motivate activity and actions.
What was interesting when we were chatting was we tend to be very pragmatic in the industry, which is like, well, I want to press this button over here and want to explain what it is. And people are going to make rational decisions around what they pay attention to. And they think like us. So it's often the way we come across it. What was interesting about when I heard you talk and when we were chatting was sometimes those messages, like, they don't listen to everything we say necessarily. Sometimes we can be talking about things and only some of it goes in. And sometimes we think we're not saying anything and some of it goes in. It was just a much more blurry than it was before. And I think you were talking a little bit around advertising at the time. Even when you got, you're not in the room, but you can hear things. Some of that's still going in and people will pick up on that. How do we start to think about that? Because that's a holistic messaging piece. It's not necessarily what you say and saying facts. It's really around how do you start to give those signals to get people to start to pay attention.
Okay, there's quite a lot to unpack with what you said there, but I think I can do it in making 2 points. Firstly, the assumption that people are rational is completely wrong. We love to think of ourselves as being reasoned and rational. I mean, the meta book that I'm writing, I describe it as being like Hannibal, because, Hannibal is this great kind of leader who challenged the Roman Empire. And all armies have terror weapons, and his terror weapon was the elephant. So people know him because he marched the elephants over the Alps, but actually the elephants were the terror weapons. He used to line them up and charge at the enemy and crush them, and that's how he'd win his battles. But that's not exactly the truth of what he was doing. What he actually did was take these poor creatures, he'd give them some kind of alcoholic fruit cocktail prior to the battle and just basically get them really, really drunk. He'd then have a bloke on top who could sort of try and steer and move them with a big stick and sort of knock them around and get them. And half the time they ran off one way, half the time they ran back over the army they were meant to be, they were fighting for. But sometimes enough of them went in the right direction to get the enemy. And that's a bit like human behavior. We're a bit like, the conscious bit of us is the bit like sitting on the kind of drunk elephant, trying to steer it in a certain direction and having some success and being able to do something, we can do it. But every now and again, that drunk elephant is going to run off in a direction and we're going to do something which is completely irrational. And then we love to post hoc pretend that actually that's the thing that we are going to do. And we all do it. We don't like to think that we do, but we all do. So firstly, never, ever, ever believe that people are going to be rational, because they aren't. They're always irrational about many things. And particularly in this situation, the rational thing to do, of course, is to engage and sort it out and work out the problem. And if there's a financial issue, then yes, of course, you have to, understand and kind of work out how the best way to proceed is. But the irrational thing to do is just go, la, 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 I'm not listening, it'll go away, which of course it won't. But it feels much better to do that. So that drunk elephant has rushed people into this kind of state of not wanting to engage. That's one point about irrationality. Don't assume rationality. People love to sin. I mean, it's a mistake that even some of the biggest brands I've worked with have made, which is to assume that you have a state of mind and all you've got to do is then transfer that state of mind into another person, and that other person will understand your perspective. And I've worked with some of the major political parties on this, and you find that they are terrible because they just think they're resolved in their own mind as to what they think they want, what they believe. And they know all the back data, all the back information, all the back stories as to why they justify it and are able to justify what they believe. And they know that they have a credible and reasoned point. The problem they don't realize is that to get people to that point, other people have to learn all that information, have all that experience that they've had. And there's a little rule about brains, is that brains are like cats and swimming. Cats can swim, but choose not to. Brains can think, but really try and avoid it at all costs. So actually saying, trying to get that information into people is really, really hard, because people just don't want to learn that stuff, your state of mind, because you want them to. And I think this is where, so we have this idea that we can't just assume that people are going to take on board all the information. So the golden rule is that there's a certain limit to the amount that people are willing to be communicated to by you. They'll listen to you for a certain amount, but don't assume they're going to listen to everything you say, because they probably won't. And they probably won't be motivated to or want to. So don't assume that you are going to give them a whole bunch of information and they're going to take that on board and think about it. They're just going to really skim it, the first little bits, or the tiny little cherry picking bits that they do, because that's all they really want to take from the information from you. I mean, the classic trick of an ad man is when a client is sort of trying to ask for them to, all these different points they want to get across. Because we've got this about our brand is great, that, and that, and that. The classic account man thing was to take a bunch of tennis balls and throw them at the client. You say, catch all of these. They catch one. They say, no, one message is better. One message gets through more easily. And that's what you've got to choose.
I was going to ask, and it might be where you're going, which is then how does that then go back to cognitive load? So if you're trying to make too many decisions, or you've got a lot of things going on in your life elsewhere, I mean, does that then change the amount of retention people can make as well? So like it becomes less, let's say you've got kids going on in the background as an example.
The thing with cognitive load is that it's what we're talking about really is something called executive function. It's part of short-term memory, which is that kind of internal talking bit that we can actually, we have that sensation of hearing when reading a book or whatever that may be. Certainly that is something that feeds into attention. But yes, if there's other stuff going on around, the problem is that that's of internal cognitive function. And that is notoriously difficult. It's virtually impossible to measure. I can't, there's no brain scanner invented that will kind of plug into your head and get you to sort of verbalize the thought that you're having at that time. It just doesn't happen. And so trying to measure those kind of things is incredibly difficult. So I'm always a fan of kind of doing it the other way around, to saying, okay, well, let's assume that people aren't going to give you full attention. I mean, great if they do, or aren't going to give you full focus, I should say, which is probably a better word. What can we do instead? Well, one of the principles is around this thing called fluent processing. The brain has various jobs that it evolved to do. It evolved to be a what happens next predictor, which is take in information and predict the next thing that happened. Another thing it evolved to do is to take on board as much information as it can and learn and understand. And it gives itself nice little dopaminergic rewards every time it does that. And it really likes it when your brain takes on board a piece of information very easily, as in you see something new and you understand it quickly. And that happens through a process called fluent processing. If a new ad or something is fluently processed, it feels familiar, it's liked more, and it's even believed more. So it's almost about trying to get people not to think, give them this kind of experience, which is incredibly fluent, incredibly easy to understand. And the easier it is to understand, the far more likely it's going to get through, firstly, when attention is full, but also secondly, when focus isn't, because you've got a far more chance of getting it into the mind if the message is simple, straightforward, or the visual aspects of it or the perception of it is easy.
Yeah, so it sounds like it's like, have less messages, make them as simple as possible. But also there you're talking a little bit around, well, then how do you have it so you engage a little bit of like cognitive function within the person you're talking to, so they almost like complete the dots to a certain extent, to then a little bit of processing then drives more engagement. And what you're actually making me think is like mystery shows on TV. So the best mystery shows on TV, for me at least, are the ones which I don't quite know what's going to happen, but I think I can work it out. And if I think I can work it out, or if I work it out, then it's sort of like it has involved me, and I sort of like I can get to the end of it. I think, well, that was good, because it makes me feel like, oh, I was able to solve something, versus being either completely clueless or it being too easy. So it's like trying to get that balance right.
With all the greatest respect, I'd say that was a different phenomenon. That's about self-generation. That's because we like to be in. This is a very long term for something that's very simple. It's called the locus of causality of behavior. That means we like our locus of causality of behavior to be internal. This means we like to be in control. And so if you're being given kind of a set of breadcrumbs towards a solution and you're working that solution out because you're generating that solution, that feels really good. I think it's more to do with that, the kind of the fluent stuff and the perceptual stuff, and it's more about actually efficiently getting information into the brain rather than you generating an answer yourself.
Okay. And the other one was that better around engagement, or is that, because that still seems quite relevant, but is that maybe that's further down that sort of like that
yeah, so
journey,
I'm still at the top end about getting information into people rather than actually getting them to think about it.
So keeping it simple is really kind of the key.
Keeping it simple and straightforward, and just assuming that people aren't going to read something, and assume people that aren't going to look at something because essentially you're trying to get them to do something that you want to do, and not everybody wants to do what you want to do. It's fine, and people want to do what they want to do. So if you make it easy for them, it's far more likely to get a good hit. So I did. So one of the, I don't know how au fait your audiences are with behavioral economics, for example, but certainly, the idea that we have two processes that allow us to make decisions. There's a conscious reasoned process, so we can think, understand, and reason our way to decision, which we do very little of, again, because we like to think we do, but we normally don't. But there's this kind of system one, which is this fast, efficient, fluent way, probably best described as intuition, that allows us to make these kind of decisions quickly and efficiently. And it's what the brain's designed to do, because actually thinking takes up calories, and we are evolved to be calorie efficient. So intuition is a very, very useful tool to make the kind of decisions that we need to make in a fast way. And these are based around a lot of things called heuristics. So when we make these intuitive decisions, there's a whole bunch of rules that allow us to do this. So you can codify how intuition works. I mean, like in Dan Ariely's book, Predictably Irrational, because you can predict how irrational people are going to be. I do this. I did do this experiment once and once only, but because it was a bit mean. But I used to commute from Brighton, and because Southern trains at the time, probably still now, necessarily the best rail service in the world, people wanted to get a seat. So people would get on the other side of the barrier and wait for the platform to be announced. The platforms could literally be anywhere. I did this with a couple of friends. A few people might chance their own walk up one platform and then drift up there on their own. But if you got you and two mates to walk up a platform, the whole platform, every crowd followed you. And that's called herding. Is that just three blokes, whatever they think? Oh, they must know something. And so they will follow. So we're pre-programmed with all of these things. And I think those are the kind of things, again, if we're trying to minimize the amount of cognition, amount of thought that has to go into it, using heuristics like that, using things like, the other classic one is loss aversion, FOMO. It's based on a thing called prospect theory. And if you're doing FOMO, then again, that's something which is hugely effective and brands use virtually. But I will struggle to find a brand that's not used FOMO in some capacity in their marketing over the last 5-10 years.
Yeah, so you're making me think. I always think of that on bin day, actually. Do I put out, if I'm first to put the wrong bins out, does everyone else follow me on the whole of the thing? It's kind of a similar kind of example. Well, I've never done an experiment. I should do an experiment with the neighbour to see if we can all get the bin wrong. There's consequences to it, unfortunately.
Yeah, I did always stick with the train example that you sort of had a vague idea which platform the train would come in on, but then you did feel like walking out the wrong platform to put the whole the commuter troop of Brighton up the wrong platform, then duck back and make sure you did get a really good seat. Anyway, but I never did that.
So I suppose we talked about how do you get people to focus. And if it is just one message, obviously, often you've got quite complex ideas that you need to try and get across. How do you sort of iterate that into beyond that first initial kind of engagement, I suppose, or that first initial touch point? How do we think about sort of like expanding? Because you do need to get to some of these more complex pieces. Is it like an iterative approach? Is it something which will expand over time? How do you sort of typically think about that?
I think it's two approaches. Firstly, if you want to get somebody to engage with one complex message, you're probably best off looking at, you've probably got about 2 seconds, I think is the answer. If you've not managed to get them to cognitively engage within the first 2 seconds, they're not going to. So you could have this kind of cascade approach of like sort of grab their focus, get them to process the thing in the first thing, make it relevant. This is where the kind of human stuff comes in, of understanding the need states and the thoughts behind the target audience that you're talking to. But working out what that one simple key core message could be that is going to motivate and going to make people want to move on to the next stage, because it is like a series of gates you've got to get through. Firstly, there's that one. Or if it's a series of messages, sending out a few kind of like, certainly it's not just on one hit, it could be over a series of communications. Get various points out over those set of communications that sort of form a story or form the information that you want to. If it's more complicated, just to say, did you realize, or whatever it may be. So there's probably two kind of approaches. But again, I don't know the area close enough to be able to comment too much on that, I think.
You see this in advertising quite a bit, but what's the role of novelty as well in some of this, in terms of like, how does that sort of play in? Because we can come out with quite dry messages sometimes, I think, where we are, and particularly repeated messages as well, versus changing things or having unusual types of things. What's the role of novelty, do you think?
The role of novelty is an interesting question, because that sort of bumps into creativity. Now, this is kind of a little industry secret that people tend not to know about, that really creativity, sometimes you get the most wonderful pieces of creativity that work enormously well, and they capture a beautiful moment. And I was at a conference not that long ago where two chaps were talking about the McDonald's eyebrows ad, where you're sort of raising the eyebrows, and they kind of linked that to the McDonald's sign and played the fantastic song by Yellow in the end, and it worked really well. And it did capture that moment when I wasn't quite sure how they managed to convince McDonald's to part with money for 400 hours of ethnography to come up with the idea that the most emotionally charged moment is at the point of anticipation. But it works, and it's great, and it's a lovely kind of linkage of the human experience, and that's brilliant. But it's not a creativity. It's just take object A and put it in context B, and thing out of context is novelty. And that's more or less what a lot of creativity can end up being if it's not good creativity. Our brains are designed to want to understand things. If you give somebody novelty, our brains are pre-programmed to want to go, I need to understand that. I need to make sense of that. How can I make sense of that? So that's certainly how you can draw focus, is by putting something in a different context that doesn't make any sense. And so you then have to understand it to make it make sense, to incorporate it into your mental representation of the world. That's why novelty is commonly used in advertising. to give people something that they want to process.
Yeah, I suppose moving into the execution of some of these things. I mean, you spent time working with companies, and there's tech companies that do some of this. And what's the role of technology and data, particularly in terms of measuring some of these things, iterating on some of these things? Where does that ecosystem kind of fit in, I suppose?
Well, I mean, measuring creativity, that's a good question. I think there are ways to do it. I think one of the things that is often considered in marketing or communications is trying to identify a user type down to the nth degree, trying to identify this pen portrait of a typical human being that we're trying to speak to, and then trying to understand that human being, which has value and has credit. But the world of cognitive science is predicated on the fact that we've got a thing in here that has got it. Think of it like the hardware of a computer. It works in a certain way. So there's a lot of capacity to be able to use those things that we know about how the mind works, how the brain works as well. When you're trying to get data, I'd always be suggestive that there are two approaches. Yes, you can find out the individual demographics and thoughts and identification of a single person. However, sometimes those can end up being quite generalized. Women are more emotional than men are more logical, men are more kind of like, reasoned and deterministic. And they can be quite cliched. But what you really need to do is actually do that and understand the specifics and the unique characteristics of your demographic rather than the generalized one. And then from that point onwards, you can start thinking about the cognitive science because that applies to everybody's brain, not just a particular subset of people of the target audience that you want to speak to.
Do you think this personalization is going to change? So, I mean, so we're in this world of AI, I suppose. I use that sort of in quotes to a certain extent, but it allows you to process much more detail. If you look at things like some of the social media platforms, I mean, they're processing personalization almost like to an extreme versus what we would see typically elsewhere. I mean, how much of that stuff do you think can help in terms of driving more personalization to get beyond sort of like broad brush, which, as you say, can often be cliches?
Well, again, personalization is based on the assumption that what you want to do is, I mean, I talked to an AI expert at a conference not that long ago, and they were saying that if you happen to be, sort of thinking about something or talking about something, and then suddenly an advert appears for it, it definitely isn't just coincidence. And I think, but the assumption behind that is that anybody who's discussing a topic is definitely going to be at that point in the kind of the purchase funnel, whereby they're at the right bottom end where they're just about to purchase. And what you want to do is jump in quickly and go, no, we've got one of those. But it's more complicated than that. And I think this kind of idea that, I mean, yeah, there is some merit in it. But if you looked at my social media activity, you will note that I predominantly interact with forums on Oriental cats, because I have 3, old West German pottery, and science. Not sure what you're going to do with that. I mean, I think there's this whole idea of synthetic data is coming through now. And again, it's problematic because what you're trying to do, I mean, AI is fantastic when you give it a set of rules. It can learn that set of rules and it can apply that set of rules, and that's fine. And this is why I'm working with a company called Dragonfly AI at the moment, because that's what they do for attention. I'm doing it for emotion and memory and other things as well. So we've got the set of rules. Other companies have taken the kind of the other approach, whereby they say, okay, well, let's look at all these kind of human beings. We know that clients love a good demographic. And let's try and work out how all these people think. But essentially what you're trying to do is tell AI to organize and understand chaos. And it can't. It's got to have a root in how it understands and a set of rules that how it understands. Interesting one. I mean, even this kind of synthetic data whereby you take all of these kind of measures and then you kind of, essentially you're just taking kind of like, 50 measures. And if you haven't got people of a certain kind with something, you can fill it in with other bits. It sort of works. But there's a little bit more to it than that. And I think it'll never be perfect and it'll never represent, because you need a general human intelligence. And one of my old academic mates, a guy called Professor Anil Seth, he wrote I'll plug his book because it's a bloody good book. It's called Being You. I think I agree with him that AI is going to get far more intelligent, but don't assume that intelligence is going to lead to anything like consciousness, anything like a human experience. And I think there's an assumption that AI is going to be able to produce all these wonderful answers, but it can't. I mean, I was reading today, AI has generated new forms of antibiotics for things that couldn't be cured before. And that makes perfect sense because there's a set of rules as to how antibiotics interact with viruses and diseases and infections. And it makes perfect sense because there's rules, and AI is very good at iteratively exploring all of those examples and doing it again and again to get the right answer. But if you just give it a whole bunch of human behavior, which is basically chaotic because there are so many different levels to it, then I don't think it's going to do very well. And because there's nothing for it to chew into.
One of the differences that strikes me, the difference between, I suppose, AI and humans, or one of them at least anyways, is memory recall, right? So they fed all this stuff into an AI, and it can look across all of that. I mean, so for example, if you've got a 360-degree camera, you're walking down the street, it can access all of that 360. I mean, as human beings, we only access what's in front of it, and actually we only remember, it seems like we only remember parts of it as well. I mean, we all go driving and we don't necessarily remember all of the journey, but we got there and obviously it went in our eyes, but we don't remember necessarily all of it. But it seems like that's quite a big difference in terms of how we would interpret or interact with the world, at least at a minimum, say.
Yeah, I mean, memory is my first subject, and so I will keep this short because we'll run out of time. Essentially, everything we experience goes into a certain extent, but it doesn't go in as like a video recording or a tape recording like we're doing today. It goes in as a set of experiences that are then added to this kind of representation of the world that you have, a schematic representation. When it goes in, it will just bind to all those kind of previous experiences. Like, you'll have a part of your mind, let's say metaphorically, the digital driving part of the mind. So every time you drive, your experience will be drawn on to be able to drive the car, but also anything that happens will kind of go in, but it will go into that kind of driving experience bit that you remember. Maybe even it's just, it's not like a sort of a video. It's not what's called episodic memory, the ability to recall an episode. I mean, if a dog runs out in front of you and you brake really hard and you save the dog, yeah, absolutely, that'll go into episodic memory. But the vast majority of it will just be kind of things happening as you go through, and you can try and replay them, but they probably won't be there. That they'll be there in some fashion because it will all have added to that kind of. That people drive to work every day, and they'll drive to work and have the same. Basically a very similar experience every day, but every now and again it'll like that. But you might notice that one line of traffic goes better than the other, so you'll switch to a line of traffic or whatever that might be. But yeah, it's just this kind of singular representation that then is added to. And if an event happens, it's highly likely that you're going to conflate that, unless it's particularly salient, like the dog running out. You're going to conflate any experience as being with something that happened that day or another day, and you won't know exactly when it happened, but it did happen. So.
Well, it's a fascinating topic. Where do you think, and what's the latest research or the biggest ideas that you think we can adopt across different parts of processes in industry? What should we be looking out for or thinking about, do you think?
I think the best uses of it are, as I've described, which is where there are rules, there are decisions, there are codifications that you can do. And part of the challenge of the world, I mean, certainly in your sector, I think there would be a very good opportunity to sort of codify what does and doesn't work and see how well that can be codified, and actually sort of start doing some proper behavioral experiments to say, well, we've tried all these different approaches. What works, what doesn't? Okay, can we find the codification, the psychology behind what we think works, what we think doesn't, rather than maybe taking each thing as an individual route. I mean, I presume that organizations have their own preferred route, but is there psychology behind why that works and try to work out what that is? I think that would be a useful thing to do. I try not to predict on the simple grounds that there was a paper done about 20 years ago where or maybe about 30 years ago, where they got all of the world's leading experts in all of the areas that they could think of, put them all together and got to say what's going to happen in your area in the next 25 years. And these were the people who were literally the leaders in all of their fields, and they were all wrong for the simple reason that we're designed to be in the moment. We're not designed to be in the future. Our brains are designed, the hardware is designed to take on board all of the information that's around us at the moment, take it on board and predict what's going to happen in the next 2-3 seconds.
Yeah.
Trying to do something whereby you are mentally constructing a world in the future with things that you don't know are going to be there, and then imagine yourself there and then try and work out what else is going to be there is an enormously difficult thing to do. And this is why most predictions are usually wrong. And so I would always say, look at what's happening at the moment and imagine the world being an extension of what that is. I mean, dipping into popular culture for a second, noted that Back to the Future was on TV recently, repeated yet again. And, the world that they invented for themselves. And I actually saw a little documentary on it, what they were trying to do. And they were trying to take the right approach, which is, let's look at human behavior now, and let's try and think how that human behavior would be the same kind of thing. Hence the reason why the world they created was sort of a kind of advertising heavy dystopia. But, and some of it was kind of there, but, I think they were sort of right. But, obviously we don't quite have floating skateboards yet, which is a bit of a shame.
Yeah,
but,
because we went past Back to the Future Day, didn't we? Which was actually the day that was mentioned in the thing, which was actually.
Oh, we're well past that now. Yeah.
Yeah. And floating skateboards haven't happened.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's far more about how people. I mean, the one thing that always consistent is that people are always. I mean, the other people are always far more influenced by the current day. So my other great love is archaeology. I love ancient stuff, and I saw an excellent program not that long ago about Stonehenge, and all the theories to what Stonehenge are. And like in original times, it was all about kind of Greek gods and monoliths, because of course all the archaeologists out in the early 20th century were all kind of, at public school, academic, read their Greek, read their Latin, read their classics or whatever. And so they interpret it in that way, because that was their kind of framework for interpretation. And then the next lot come along and they're kind of like looking at kind of social interactions and the way it was kind of like socially, because that was their education. And basically all the theories about Stonehenge, you can pretty much map the education of the archaeologists who came up with it, rather than actually sort of the practical application or practical world of investigation of what it was. And I think we're always far more influenced by these things than we like to. So again, if you're going to predict the future, think humans are going to be doing the same thing. Humans were doing the same thing, back in those days. I went to a place called Paestum, Phoenician in Italy. And, you look at the layout of the town, or you look at Pompeii, it's the same place. I mean, we could literally be living there today. We've just got a ton more technology. The structure is more or less, obviously minus the gladiator fights and slaves and stuff. And I think we've got to look at this, the ability for humans to be humans, because we will always be that way and we can't help ourselves being human. Always think that actually it's going to be very similar to the kind of human behavior that we have today.
Well, so I think that's a fantastic message. Dr. Ali, I really appreciate you making the time and going through it and educating me as well. I think is
well. I think likewise. I mean, it's not an area that I have ever interacted with much, so it's interesting to find out about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating, because I do think there's definitely ideas from different fields that are very, very applicable across fields as well. And so I think it's fascinating. So thanks very much.
Absolute pleasure.